Thank you very much for being here on this important occasion, important for everyone. We woke up on Thursday morning last week to find the shocking developments of the invasion of Ukraine, which obviously events before that had anticipated to a certain extent, but I think everybody shared in that enormous sense of shock. I'm really grateful to Brendan Flynn and Sociology and Politics for suggesting this occasion, to Róisín and to Ekaterina for being willing to speak on this theme and to enhance our understanding of something which has really shattered the peace of Europe and constitutes this remarkable event, really, since World War II of territorial expansion within Europe. I'm not going to say too much by way of introduction, just to offer the stage to those who have kindly agreed to speak. We'll have kind of 5-minute contributions thereabouts, and then plenty of time for questions and follow-ups at different times. So I'm going to start with Róisín, and so over to you. Thanks very much. And Healy. Be careful, let's just put the acrobatics involved.
No. Good afternoon. Ukraine is no stranger to war. It belongs to the so-called bloodlands of Europe, a vast swathe of territory stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea that was the scene of intense fighting and brutal occupation regimes in both World War I and World War II. The Eastern Front in World War I swung back and forth through Ukraine, bringing 1.5 million Ukrainian deaths alongside mass displacement and waves of repression. The chaos brought by the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian withdrawal from the war facilitated the establishment of a Ukrainian People's Republic in 1918. Statehood proved short-lived, however, as it was quickly crushed by the Bolsheviks. Indeed, Ukraine became mired in a prolonged military struggle that saw Kyiv change hands 16 times and a further 500,000 Ukrainians die until it was formally incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1922. Ukraine returned to the front line of war 17 years later. To give one example, the city of Lviv, now the last stage in the journey for hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians fleeing towards the border with Poland, but then part of Poland. Lviv was captured by the Soviets in 1939, by the Germans in 1941, and then again by the Soviets in 1944. In the meantime, the Nazis murdered much of Ukraine's Jewish population and seized more than 2 million Ukrainians as slave laborers for the Reich. The decision by the Soviet Union to annex Western Ukraine after the war resulted in the forced resettlement of 140,000 Ukrainians to Western Poland. Some former slave laborers chose to emigrate westwards too for fear of being persecuted as collaborators, and experienced that befell the grandparents of our own colleague in French, Sylvie Mossé, who has written about it recently. There was, of course, real wartime collaboration, as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists calculated that the Nazis might be better masters than the Soviets. 100,000 Russian soldiers reached a similar conclusion when they defected to the German side. Ireland, located on Europe's western fringe, had no comparable experience in the 20th century. To take death tolls alone, the revolutionary period in Ireland gave rise to just 4,000 deaths. This was just 6% of the proportion of Ukrainians killed in their struggle for independence between 1917 and 1923. Deaths in World War II between ethnic Ukrainians in the Red Army and civilians amount to several million. In political terms, too, Ireland enjoyed much greater success. We are this year marking the 100th anniversary of Irish independence. By 1922, Eastern Ukraine was firmly under the thumb of the Soviet Union, and Western Ukraine that of Poland. Up to 1922, however, Ireland did have much in common with Ukraine, in the sense that both suffered from the imperial ambitions of their neighbours, if in Ireland's case, just the one. The expansion of England into Ireland and Russia and Poland into Ukraine created or bolstered an ethnic elite at odds with the bulk of the population. The Anglo-Irish ascendancy had their counterpart in the Poles and Russians of Ukraine, who owned much of the land, dominated the towns, spoke their own versions of Slavic, and in some cases espoused a different faith. Constance Markiewicz's husband, Kazimir, is a good example of this, an ethnic Pole and Roman Catholic who owned an estate in Ukraine farmed by Orthodox Ukrainian-speaking peasants. Moreover, the governments of both Ireland and Ukraine systematically subordinated the economic interests of their peoples to those of the core. The famines endured by both Ireland in the 1840s, Ukraine in the 1930s, are the most egregious example of this. While not designed as genocide, both famines were exacerbated by the contempt of the central government for the well-being of the peoples of Ireland and Ukraine. The death toll was very similar. About an eighth of the population died in each case, 1 million in Ireland, 4 million in Ukraine. Although it should be pointed out that the Ukrainian population recovered within a couple of decades, whereas Ireland's population continued to decline for over a century. That said, Irish nationalists were able to exploit the famine for propaganda advantage, whereas Ukrainians were forbidden to speak of it in public or in private until 1989. Just like the British government in Ireland, the regimes that governed Ukraine undermined native culture both actively and passively. While the Habsburgs who ruled Western Galicia, Western Ukraine or Galicia from 1772 to 1918 were the most benign, they devolved government from the late 1860s to the Polish community who used electoral inequalities and fraud to disadvantage the large Ukrainian minority, much as Unionists did to nationalists for many decades in Northern Ireland. The interwar Polish state sought to civilize the Ukrainians by sending Poles to teach their children, while also waterboarding Ukrainian nationalists in detention camps. Russia, both before and after 1917, was more aggressive. It suppressed the Uniate or Greek Catholic Church, a compromise church formed in 1596 that owed allegiance to the Pope while maintaining Orthodox rites. In 1863, it banned the use of the Ukrainian language in public and in print. Indeed, apart from a lull between 1905 and the early decades of Bolshevik rule, Russia systematically privileged its own language and people over indigenous Ukrainian speakers. As in Ireland, language shift happened by a process of attrition. Years of official denigration and underinvestment in education and publishing led many people in Ireland and Ukraine to abandon their indigenous languages for English and Russian. That did not, of course, necessarily mean a declaration of loyalty to the regime in question. We, of all people, should understand that it is possible to speak the language of the colonizer while identifying with indigenous culture and pledging loyalty to the state associated with it. Yet language shift did make it more difficult for nationalists in Ireland and Ukraine to be taken seriously internationally. Most obviously, both failed to gain recognition at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Irish nationalists struggled for years to convince outsiders that Irish constituted a nation of their own, when most spoke English rather than Irish. Ukrainians had the added difficulty that their language was so close to Russian. Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian all derived from Church Slavonic. But the Russification movement of the late 19th century invented a hierarchy that denigrated Ukrainian and Belarusian as late offshoots of Russian, and favored the title of Little Russia over Ukraine. As a Slavic people and members of the Orthodox Church, Ukrainians could claim neither racial nor religious difference from the Russians either. Yet from the mid-19th century onwards, Ukrainian intellectuals began to assert the cultural uniqueness of the people inhabiting the area of modern-day Ukraine, and to criticize foreign rule. They identified 9 provinces that they designated as Ukrainian, and popularized the term Ukraina for them. They created a body of literary works, grammars, and dictionaries to emphasize the distinctiveness of the Ukrainian language, and developed a historical narrative to challenge Russian claims to the heritage of Kievan Rus. By the 1920s, peasants had come to see themselves as Ukrainians. This national identity waned in subsequent decades in the face of Soviet repression, only to wax with independence in 1991 and the Euromaidan in 2013-14. But Ukrainians have no need to apologise for their particular historical trajectory. In 2022, one can safely say that the vast majority of Ukrainians are committed to political independence and to democracy. In this sense, the Irish and the Ukrainians share the same values, although only the Ukrainians are called upon to defend them with their lives.
Thank you very much, Róisín. One of those striking realizations that our situation mightn't differ enormously. There are plenty of analogies there to think about. So, Flynn, Brendan's going to go next, and
I will actually.
you are going to come to the podium. Good.
Try not to trip over first of all.
Well, that's the first order of business. So.
If you don't mind, folks, I'll take the mask off and then I'll remask again. I've nothing so polished as Róisín's absolutely lucid and fluid, coherent set of notes and discussion points there. I just really thought I'd try and give you something a little bit different. I'm not going to give you something upbeat or positive, and so don't blame me afterwards and say we wanted something hopeful. That'll be a different department. But I want to give you maybe something that's a little bit different from the amount of coverage, and some of you are following this conflict very closely on social media. I do want to say that political scientists are notorious for being dispassionate and cold and clinical in how they dismiss the actual lives of entire nations with one or two sentences. So I'm aware that there's a lot of human suffering. I'm not at all unambiguous about who the aggressor party is in this conflict, but that doesn't lead me to say things that are offensive to Russian culture and Russian people, and I don't feel the need to move into a space of virulent anti-Russianism. I think the Russians deserve better than what Putin has delivered. But I've no ambiguity at all, just in case it's not clear from what I say, that the aggressor is the Russian Federation and Putin, and that the victims here are the Ukrainians, and all our sympathies and support should be with them. I'd said that, just in case it's not clear from what I say. I'm trying to think and I'm just trying to think about how this ends. And I'm just trying to think about where it goes. And I'm just trying to think about scenarios. In fact, there's a branch of international relations called Analogical Reasoning, where you get analogies, and you basically say, well, this is analogous to that, and we can draw some lessons. But of course, you quickly realize there's no two scenarios that are perfectly similar, not least in history, but even in contemporary history or recent events. So it's an imperfect exercise, but it can actually give some insights. I'm going to suggest there are three analogies or scenarios. One is, this might end in the short term like the Georgia war ended. So in 2008, the Russians and the Georgians had a conflict from August the 7th or August the 8th up until August the 12th. And how that ended was Sarkozy, do you remember him? French president, he phoned up Putin and he agreed to get a ceasefire. And the nature of the ceasefire was the Russians pulled their military back. They went back to the positions they were in, and the fighting more or less stopped. Georgia remained an independent nation state, albeit an independent nation state with the Russian military occupying illegally under international law enclaves with various ethnic groups who identify with Russia. And also Georgia was, of course, shattered economically, socially. Militarily, the Georgians were defeated and the Russians won that war. It was a short, sharp, vicious war. And very much therefore not like what we're seeing now, which is a much extensive, larger, wide-ranging, more violent, more unrestrained use of force. So that leads me to think that the Georgian solution won't work. And you may have picked up on the news that Macron phoned Putin last night, or yesterday afternoon rather, and it seems that he didn't get anything out of that conversation, at least that were in the public domain, that was anything other than just a reprise of the usual refrain from Putin. So in other words, I don't think we're going to get a quick end to this conflict. There may be a tactical ceasefire, and it suits both parties to, for instance, evacuate civilians from Kiev. For the Russians, it's a form of ethnic cleansing because they're getting rid of people who are anti-Russian, right? And also it's a weaponization of humanitarian refugee flows into Poland, into Slovakia, into Hungary. I mean, the level of the refugee flows is literally biblical. We're talking almost close to 1 million already, and by the middle of the summer you could have up to 5 million, 6 million Ukrainians moving into Slovakia, moving into Hungary, moving into Romania. So in this city we're going to see hundreds and thousands of Ukrainians in Galway by the end of the summer, or by the winter, or by the time we're here. That's what it means for us. The Ukrainians, I think, might agree to a tactical ceasefire. They're going to run out of ammunition. They're going to run out of ammunition, according to the military experts, sometime in the middle of next week or at the end of next weekend. So I think you might see a tactical ceasefire, but I don't think you'll see an end to the war. And I think the Georgia war, it suited Putin to end the war, in inverted commas, it's a frozen conflict, because he had a military victory. He hasn't had a military victory yet, and he will continue this until, within his own terms of reference, he gets a military victory. So that's very bad news, because what that means is a long extended siege of Kiev and Kharkiv and other cities in the Ukraine. When I say long, the siege in Aleppo, which the Russians engineered for the Assad regime, lasted from the summer of 2016 to December 2016, 4 months of butchery. The siege of Sarajevo went on a very, very long time. The siege of Grozny went on for about 4 months. So the bad news is, anyone who's telling you that this could be finished and ended very quickly as soon as it started, I would be very skeptical, unfortunately, of that. The second analogy, or the second scenario, is the Finland idea that those of you who know your history, and there may even be somebody from Finland in the room, you may be aware that after the Second World War, Finland ended up on the wrong side of history, so to speak. They aligned themselves with Nazi Germany. It's a complex history. They actually fought a war against Stalin and the Soviet Union almost before the Second World War kicked off. And so they had a second round of fighting with the Russians. They sided with Nazi Germany, and they signed a separate armistice with Soviet Union, with Stalin, in the just before the end of the war. Stalin was preoccupied with controlling Berlin and Poland. He wasn't so much interested in the Finns, and uncharacteristically for Stalin, who wasn't noted for his generosity, he agreed to a treaty with Finland which allowed them two crucial things. One, they could have free and fair elections. They were allowed to be a liberal democracy. Thanks, Joseph, thanks for that. And the second thing, he allowed them to trade with Sweden and with England or Britain. So they were allowed to be a pretty normal Western economy. Fundamentally, Stalin was happy to allow Finland be a Western-style country, but they had to agree to neutrality. They had to be neutralized. They had to agree to a Soviet military base, which only was removed in 1956. And the Russians periodically interfered in Finnish politics in the late 50s, again in 1961, and the Russians ended up more or less hand-picking a senior Finnish politician called Kekkonen, who was an intermediary between Moscow and Helsinki. Finland was a democracy during the Cold War, but only just. And it was heavily qualified, and basically it was a vassal state of the Soviet Union, at least as regards security and foreign policy. Now, would that work for the Ukraine? Some people have seized on this and said that's what we should have used to try and, placate Putin, or maybe Putin. I don't think so. I don't think Putin will accept a Ukraine that has free and fair elections. I don't think Putin will accept a Ukraine that can trade with the European Union. And the reason is, he requires a Ukraine that looks and feels like Belarus, which is a completely subjugated, totalitarian or authoritarian state. There was a debate in political science whether we should now describe Belarus and Russia as totalitarian or authoritarian. It's probably safer to describe them as authoritarian. It's not the full totalitarian extent, but it's getting there very fast. And this war is part of that process in domestic Russian politics. So I think the Finland idea as a solution simply won't work. The context is quite different. It's far too late for that. It didn't work very well for the Finns, and you can just ask the Finns about that as well. 46 years of living under the cosh of Khrushchev and Brezhnev and Stalin does bad things for your morale and for your psychic well-being. I think the final scenario or analogy, and this is something which is not good, is there is also the analogy of Kashmir, which is disputed territory between Pakistan and India. And Kashmir was partitioned in 1948, and then it was repartitioned by force of arms. The Indians and the Pakistanis fought vicious wars, and the latest war was in '65, and then they fought proxy wars and covert wars. Pakistan has fueled, arms, sustained a massive insurgency in Kashmir, which the Indian state has responded with the characteristic brutality of most countries who are involved in an insurgency, whether they're dictatorships or whether they're democracies. About maybe up to 100,000 people have died in the insurgency in Kashmir. It's not resolved, it's ongoing. And this is really bad news, because I think from a military perspective, what we're beginning to see is the situation on the ground is moving towards a de facto partition of the Ukraine. Along the line of the Dnieper River, which comes down from the north, runs through Kiev itself, or Kiev, and goes all the way down towards the south. And then the Russians will presumably want to push on and extend and control the Odessa and the coastal districts leading up to Moldova. And there is a Russian territory which the Russians have illegally, in violation of all international law, occupied in Moldova, called Transnistria. And there are Russian forces there. So they may actually connect up. So you might end up with a kind of L-shaped Eastern People's Republic of Ukraine and then a Western Ukraine. Would that be, is that where we're headed? Well, the bad news is, if we are, that's not stable. And B, secondly, I don't think Putin will even agree to that. Because if you think about it from a military point of view, and this is where he's at now, it's all locked into this inexorable zero-sum military logic. He cannot allow an independent Western rump Ukraine to exist, because that independent Western Ukraine will forever be the South Korea to the North Korea. It will be forever the beacon of freedom and democracy. It will also be a military threat. It will be a staging ground for insurgents to come into eastern Ukraine. So Putin will want to push. Everyone's focused on Kiev. My focus and my concern is the border between Poland and Ukraine. From a military point of view, the Russians will sooner or later have to make a decision. Are they going to seal that border, or are they going to let that border be open? Because if they don't seal that border, then insurgents are pouring across that border. There are thousands of Ukrainian men and women who are going back across the border. They're going the other direction to fight. For now, they're not very well armed, but there's a question mark for how well armed and how supported they will be. And there's a question mark for us, in the royal us of Europeans and the West. There's a question mark for America. Are you actually seriously going to sustain a large insurgency against the Russian Federation? Are you going to do that for a few weeks or a few months, or are you going to see that out for years? And if you're going to be doing that, and these are my final points, I'm sure I'm close on time, what does all this mean for the European perspective and international relations or security, and what does it all mean for our understanding of international politics now? I'm getting very big in my resolution here, so the accuracy and the credibility maybe of the assertion is more heavily qualified. But I think one thing I'm pretty sure of, I was at conferences, and funny, I was at an international relations conference online in January, and there was a bunch of people arguing, are we in a Cold War again? And there was actually some very, people I respect saying, don't use that word, we're wrong to use that word, we shouldn't use the word Cold War, it's a mistake, we're not in a Cold War with the Russians. We emphatically are in an insanely hot Cold War with the Russians again. The West is locked into a very long and uncertain, unclear Cold War. It's analogous, if you're a Cold War historian or if you're interested in Cold War studies, it's very close to the period in the early 80s and in the late 70s, when NATO decided the only way they could deal with the Russians was to ratchet up their military posture, their conventional deterrence and their nuclear deterrence. So what's going on in Poland right now, and what's going on in the Baltics, and what's going on in Berlin is an epiphany that we will have to ramp up our military presence in Germany, in Poland, and in the Baltic states. So that's a Cold War. That's a massive, raging Cold War. And the Cold War, if you know your history, went into various periods when it was very uncertain that it was going to end well. At most of those moments, we know it did end well, but that was not a given at those moments. The final thing, and I'm really going to shut up now because Ekaterina wants to come in, is what does it all mean for our understanding of international relations? I think it's a multipolar world. I think the rules-based international order, you might have heard that piece of jargon. Irish diplomats love RBIO, the rules-based international order, God love us. Because we're a tiny little country, we believe in soft power, we believe in the rule of law, we believe in culture, We believe in human rights. The bad news is the big, powerful actors on the stage of world politics don't. And what they see is you can wage unilateral wars in complete violation of the UN Charter, and just maybe you can get away with it. Very bad news if you're China, very bad news if you're some other actors. So I would situate this conflict and punctuate a lot of the details of the last few years between the invasion of Iraq by America, which was probably illegal, I leave that to the lawyers, illegal and in breach of the UN consensus, and definitely a unilateral invasion of another country, and then we have a Russian unilateral invasion. Welcome to the 21st century.
Very much, Brendan. So, Ekaterina Yahyaoui is in the Irish Centre for Human Rights.
So I will have a few slides just because I will show you text. Okay, it's not that I it's something, but law works with text, so that's why I will need that. But yeah, hopefully. Anyways, and the thing that I want to will say will resonate a lot with what you said, Brendan. So it will be about the role of international law. And again, don't interpret some of the things that I will say wrong, because I will say, as we say, Russian intervention is in breach of international law, so that's all obvious. But I think if we want to reflect deeply on lessons that we can learn from that situation and about the role of international law in this situation, we need to go beyond that simple statement and think deeper about this conflict and what it shows us, let's say, what it reveals us about law and actually rule-based order, which some countries like so much. So international law, the first thing that we need to realize that when we talk about international law and its role, law is international. It's law between states. It places very strong emphasis on statehood and sovereignty. And this is very important to understand certain things that are happening now. And actually in order also to understand Russian arguments, because they are a manipulation, but manipulation of things that international law gives them. And so the first thing that I will show you is one advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which is the main international court that we have. And this was an advisory opinion about the legality of use of nuclear weapons. Because it is a 96 advisory opinion, so we are well beyond the Cold War. We know also at this time how serious the type of serious consequences that it can have for people, for human beings, like when you use nuclear weapons. And we know how Japan had a very long recovery from that. And we know how awful it is. Also, it was after the Chernobyl accident, so judges knew about it. And being asked that question, you see the final answer about the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons of the International Court of Justice in '96 is, and it's the second paragraph. In the current state of international law, the court cannot conclude definitely whether the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be lawful or unlawful in an extreme circumstance of self-defense in which the very survival of the state would be at stake. So what international law cares about is the state. Okay? And the state means necessarily sovereignty. And sovereignty necessarily means power. I will come to that point because this is also very important for the current situation. So in terms of sort of just assessing legality, these are the things that you may be heard very much in the news, and this is everywhere. So we have in the UN Charter the main principle here. Of course, we have equality of states. This is very important also. But then we have the paragraph 4, which says that still members of the UN are states, and this is again, we are talking just about states. Members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. This is the principle. But then we have an exception. So the UN Charter itself is based on the logic of rule exception, and so on and so forth. And this exception is what President Putin used in his speech, and that's what he referred to. This is the right to self-defense. And I am emphasizing here again the language which is used in this article. First of all, nothing in the present chapter impairs the right to self-defense. Nothing means also not human rights, because human rights are part of the language of the UN Charter. Right to self-defense is the right of the members of the United Nations, so it's the right of states. We are not talking here about self-defense of the individuals or anything, it's states. And state its territory with the sovereignty. And this right is inherent to states. It's just something you cannot take away from them. So this is something which plays into the Russian president's argument, where he tries to use this logic, let's say. However, the difficulty here, legally speaking, and I will not go into details, and that's where we actually reject the arguments made by the Russian president in his speech. Because the article says if an armed attack occurs, it's not just in any situation that you can use use armed force. And the whole question in international law is, when is it? When does this armed attack occur? And we for sure know that it's not the situation in Ukraine. Although we know historically that there were many attempts by different states to interpret this beyond the text. Basically, some concepts like preventive self-defense, anticipatory self-defense, and so on. And the lawyers all the time rejected all these types of claims, including those by the US and NATO and so on. So this was majority position, let's say, of international lawyers. Like somebody said, 99.9% of international lawyers. So you see how focused on the state and the sovereignty international law is. And here we come to another point where international law and sovereignty is power. And here we have another point where we talk about the power in international law. Basically, instead of having a rule-based order, we have an order which allows power to play a very, very important role. Because again, something if you read the different analysis and reports, we have Security Council that can make binding decisions, and these decisions can be vetted by those permanent members of the Security Council, among which are Russia, US, UK, China, and France. So, and that's what Russia used in the Security Council in different debates, or prevented some resolutions, and also what US or UK used in the past. Anyways, so that's how it's framed. It's just when you read the text, it's not always obvious, but that's how it is. And so here I come to my final points, showing why we have so many difficulties in this conflict and why international law is so maybe useless to a significant extent. And this is an analysis of sovereignty from a philosophical point of view, but this analysis is also very closely tied to law and politics. This analysis was done by Derrida. He was writing it was delivered as a lecture in 2002, just after the September 11th. And he was basically basing his analysis on the discourse which was coming from the US at the time about rogue states. And the fact that in order to stop rogue states, we can basically do a lot of things, even go beyond the text of for example, Article 51. And so, one thing that he said about the Security Council and the place of the permanent members of the Security Council, he said that it's a monstrosity. And that we can only move beyond that if we can get rid of that monstrosity. Because however much you talk about rule-based international law, if you have such an important place reserved for sovereignty and power within the institution which is supposed to prevent war, you will always have the same problem recurring. It will not disappear. Of course, we can think about solutions for the current conflict. And hopefully we will find something, because the extent of mobilization, because it's happening in Europe, is significantly bigger than in other similar situations. But if we don't think deeply about how international law and why it is unable to respond to this conflict, we will have similar situations in the future. Maybe not very near future, maybe very distant, but still. And so, important thing that if we focus on states, all states are potentially or actually states that are aggressors, because they want to defend their territory, they want to defend their sovereignty, their power basically, they want to assert their power. And so, I will not read this, I will leave you with those words, but maybe just for the last one, Derrida, he asked this question, the name of the states. At the time he answered, you can guess, United States. But today you can place here Russia. So it's, you see, and in the future maybe something else. And this is all in the logic of the international law itself, which allows for this type of actions. And so when Derrida was thinking about it, he was trying to find a solution. He said one thing that is needed, we need to separate sovereignty from this unconditionality which it brings with itself. For me, in terms of human rights law, it means that we need to switch our attention from the state to human beings. And that's what I'm trying to say all the time. But in the present conflict also, the problem is that we talk so much about sovereignty and borders of Ukraine. It's the way we are used to respond to these situations. But I think it's more important to think about human rights and human suffering than about sovereignty and borders, because we are basically reasserting the same problematic central thing within the structure of international law and maybe even international relations. So it's not my area, but I think maybe some are thinking in terms of states. We need to switch our attention to human beings, because this suffering and the problem which we have today is a result of many other issues that we ignored in the past, including human rights issues. So one example that I can give, and I will stop maybe, I will give just two examples, so they will stop. One example is if you followed the protests in Belarus against the re-election of the president, very recent ones. Reaction was, of course, people like in Europe and some governments issued expression of support for protesters and so on, but basically the reaction was almost absent. And I think to myself, if the reaction would be different at that time and he wouldn't be re-elected and not in power now, would we have the situation we have today? Maybe not. Maybe yes. I don't know the answer to that. And then another thing is, I just was looking at the news this morning, and in Russia they adopted this morning a law. I made notes here, which makes punishable any call for sanctions against Russia, any fakes about military and the discreditation of Russian military, and the punishment is up to 15 years of prison. So you can imagine, like we heard about some protests in Russia, but you can imagine how these people will suffer and continue to suffer. And I heard somebody saying that maybe many of them are arrested and maybe we will never see them again. So it's human suffering that I think we need to switch our attention to rather than think about just sovereignty and borders. So that's my
Thank you very much. Plenty of time for questions, contributions, issues that people would like to raise. We certainly covered a great deal of ground, and I think it's important to introduce these different perspectives precisely because they don't get the kind of attention in the midst of all the necessary reporting. So, yes, back there.
I'm just wondering, could somebody clarify for me, is it true that Ukraine itself means borderlands? That is true. And that these borders have been fluctuating for centuries, and that Russia was originally founded as a state from Kiev.
Well,
Yeah, Róisín might comment on what you mentioned.
Yes and no. I mean, Ukraine is literally means borderland, and that was a term that I think came up first in around the 18th century, because of course borders change all the time in Central Europe. In terms of Kiev and Rus, that's very disputed. This was a territory, medieval territory around Kiev. At one point stretched from the whole way from the north to the south, a very, very big state.
Yes, they were Vikings.
Exactly. Yeah. The Russians kind of claimed the claim that they were the heirs to that. In fact, at that point, they were developing their own state of Muscovy, and then Peter the Great changed the name of Muscovy to Russia, so he could kind of claim that. So that's kind of the start of this great Russian narrative that then has laid claim to this territory.
Ekaterina,
Yeah, just one point, because according to what I read, and I'm not a historian, but I was just because I was so interested in all those issues. This term itself, Kiev and Rus, is a late creation. Like in the 19th century, I think they created this term to just explain the history a little bit. So it wasn't the term that originally this territory claimed for itself, let's say.
Okay, so it's disputed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks.
questions, comments, want to raise?
Matthew.
Oh, yes, Matthew.
So I have two comments. One on the Kiev and Rus and the Ukraine, and then I ask a question. So the etymology of Ukraine, it's double. The one about the Ukraine as a borderland comes from Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's history, and that's one way of looking at it. And Ukrainians really prefer seeing this as Kraina is the land in both Polish and Ukraine, like, you know. So Ukraina means in the land, like, you know. So this kind of as etymology could be seen as this is a local land, this is the land, our land, and this sort. So Ukraine really has two etymologies: the one that comes from local understanding of the words, and the other one from this Polish-Lithuanian history. But the actual questions that I have, and the Kiev and Rus, yeah, that doesn't really matter now anymore. So I have some questions and comments to Brandon. Are you familiar with the Euro-Asian project proposed by Dugin and his followers? And it's built on 19th century ideas. Now it's called Neo-Euro-Asian project. And so you said that we're living in a multipolar world, and I think we're still not there, and I hope that we're not, because the multipolar world would mean we have a new concert of empires, or at best we have the failure of League of Nations with loads of different power brokers, like now. So that brings me to a question: do you think that the realism, this offensive realism, like, you know, that's the American term, but like that's really what it comes down to in geopolitics, proposed by Eurasian project? Is it a threat to the whole of the project of liberal democracies? Because that's what Dugin claims in his book, that in his books in general, in everything he wrote, that liberal democracy is the enemy, it's an existential threat to Eurasian project, and it's an existential threat to Russia, its identity. It's very spiritualistic and mystic, like, you know, way of seeing the world. And one last thing, it's to Russian as well. So that could you tell more about the growth of the 19th and 20th, early 20th century nationalism in Ukraine? Before those things that Putin used in his statements came to be like the Lenin's and Stalin's meddling in the borders and creating the Soviet Ukraine, because the Ukrainians were participating in the Austro-Hungarian parliament. They were participating as Ruthenians, as Arius Ukrainians. They were participating politically in the Galician parliament. There was a competition between the Polish, Ukrainian, and the Jewish nationalisms. in the whole of what is now Western Ukraine. So all this narrative that they are somehow created by the communist Russia, it doesn't hold really,
Yeah, so the guy that you're mentioning is one of the ideologues that Putin would probably be informed by, and it does seem that if we're, insofar as sitting here, we could piece together the rationality behind why Putin decided to go in. And normally I would resist a highly personalized account of political science. We generally stress the state, or we stress institutions. But I think the nature of the Russian regime is that it's a highly personalized autocratic regime. So it really is about Putin and about whether he's having a good or bad day or not. And so so that actually, that's an important kind of point there. Because when you're dealing, say, for instance, with the Chinese, I think it's not just about President Xi and his character and where he is and his mood. There's a much more wider systematic, the Politburo dynamics and so on, factions within the Communist Party. That's not where Russia's at now. Unfortunately for the Russians, and you'll notice how I phrase it, they seem to me to have somebody who's moved into being a category of unstable leaders. There is, if you check it out, there is a literature on dealing with unstable leaders. In fact, the Finnish President Ekaterina, who was the Russian stooge, he spent the last few years with full dementia, and they tried to cover it up, which led to all sorts of bizarre, hilarious kind of situations. Of course, that was Finland. Finland's not going to attack anybody, right? So nobody has to worry about a Finnish leader who's gone mad or crazy. But to answer your question, I think there's a mixture of reasons why Putin decided to do what he did. And one of them, but to sum it up, it's not explainable by offensive realism. Just for those in the audience who haven't sat through an international relations course, you're lucky, you probably saved many months of your lives. But I'll give you a potted history that offensive realism is an idea that comes out of the University of Chicago, and particularly associated with one professor called John Mearsheimer, who is now available to watch on YouTube. And he has a line, mind you, he's only one offensive realist. There's a bunch of them, but they are actually a small subset of the overall tradition of realism, which is a view that international relations is governed by power, and especially military power. And states and their leaders make calculations all the time about relative military power. And based on those estimations, they do their actions. And what counts are the actions. So if you build an enemy camp close to me, I will take action. So if China builds an enormous military base in Mexico, the Americans will invade Mexico. It's inexorable, it's axiomatic, it's an iron law. And you can see straight away that this theory is very reductive, it's very simplistic, it doesn't take into account history and context, it doesn't take into account all the other traditions in international relations. The big alternative tradition in international relations would be liberal institutionalism, which says the nature of the regime is the strongest predictor of whether you're going to end up in trouble with that country. So if you're dealing with a normal, nasty, kleptocratic, shitty dictatorship, that's fine. They generally keep their business in-house and they don't go looking for wars. But if you're dealing with certain types of regime which move into highly personalized authoritarian regimes, and they have identity problems, and they're coming from a place of wounded pride and insecurity, then watch out, because the nature of that regime is that it will get involved in adventures, and it will have fundamentally diminished rationality. It will not be able to make accurate, non-paranoid assessments of what it needs to do. And so you will end up with a military adventure. You will end up with some kind of assumption that they can do stuff and just break things and they'll get away with it, and that will be enough to get what they want. And that's a fundamental miscalculation. And I think the person I would associate that most was Anne Applebaum, who is a very well-known journalist, but she's actually a fine academic as well. And she's been consistently right. And she said the Putin regime is especially shitty and insane and kleptocratic. So what it will produce is especially dangerous. The other regime I would identify globally that fits that bill is North Korea. So that's that. So if you follow that a logic of regime analysis, that's the indication of the red light. So I think John Mearsheimer's view that it's basically got to do with a simplistic reading of geography, that if I build military alliances close to your home turf, you're going to attack. I think it's so reductive and so simplistic that it isn't really taken seriously by most of the broad corpus of people engaged in international relations, which is incredibly funky and diverse. It's not all offensive realism, as well you know. Sorry, I'm not sure I answered that. But
there are millions of views of Mearsheimer's thing on YouTube,
Yeah.
I've noticed, so he's certainly attracted a following. I think, Róisín, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just in terms of, I suppose, the creation of Ukrainian identity by the likes of Lenin. So really what he's saying is that there was nothing there before 1917, and the mere creation of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was really the start of it. That's not true. I mean, you know, there's plenty of evidence of Ukrainian nationalism beforehand, especially, as you suggested, in Western Ukraine, in the area of Galicia, which, as I said, was kind of outsourced to the Poles from the 1860s onwards, and there you have, and to a lesser extent in Russian-held Ukraine, you have a language movement, mainly based on language, trying to build up a sense of identity. There are Ukrainian representatives in the Galician parliament who are looking for more rights, let's say, for a Ukrainian language university, because Lviv at that time was part of Poland, had a Polish minority, but the surrounding area was Ukrainian speaking, and there was a rising class of Ukrainian intellectuals. They were generally fairly moderate in what they looked for. Nobody was really looking for independence. They were looking for more kind of not even devolved government, but just recognition. Very little violence. There was one assassination of the governor of Galicia by a Polish or a Ukrainian student in 1908. But from our perspective, not at all, radical or ambitious in terms of its goals. And in Russia it was even less so because of the coincidence of religion between the ruler and the ruled. Now the Russians also forcibly converted people from the Uniate Church back to the Orthodox Church too. So the Russians were responsible for that. I suppose it is true to say that the creation of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic did boost nationalism because it brought in this kind of Korenizatsiya program, right? So a kind of a renationalization project, lots of funding for Ukrainian schools, and you and I were at the seminar yesterday, and I asked the speaker, she was an author of a history of Ukrainian nationalism, I said, when do the peasants become, Ukrainians? And she said it was at that moment in the 1920s. Because of that influence. So in a sense the Soviets facilitated it, but that's not to take away from it. We think so much of Irish nationalism emerged as a reaction to the actions of the English state, whether it be the confiscations of the 16th and 17th centuries, or the famine, or attempted reformation and so forth. So that's not to take away from Ukrainian nationalism, just to say that these things are the products of these structural forces.
Just one thing to say, it's very interesting to hear these questions about Ukrainian nationhood for myself as an international lawyer, because in international law it doesn't matter if Ukrainians are really Ukrainian or not. It doesn't matter. It was recognized as a state when the Soviet Union fell, and Russia recognized it as a state. So we don't ask those questions in international law at all. It's just a matter of fact. You agreed that it's a state, so you have to respect what you have agreed. So it's interesting that this question becomes so hotly debated. And then if you think about history of statehood of other states in Europe, it's also not obvious, like what is a German state and how it's different from Austria, for example. These are all similar questions to me. So I'm just sometimes surprised by the extent to which this becomes important in the debates about this situation. Yeah.
Interesting. There was a question at the back, and I see with various different hands. So,
two very quick questions. Thank you to the panel, by the way, for all your contributions. One is kind of international, the other domestic. They both maybe fall slightly more into Brendan's bailiwick, but by no means exclusively. It's just in relation to your presentation, Brendan. If, say, for instance, in your opinion, or the panel's opinion, the invasion of Ukraine, does that make Taiwan's position more or less secure now? And does that depend on whether it's a protracted war or a Georgia-type conflict? And then from a domestic perspective, I've noted some changes in political discourse over the last couple of days and the week about our position on military neutrality, political neutrality, etc. A lot of changes in social media too, I think. Some of the different talking heads have got different positions now than they might have had a few weeks ago. Is that a sustained change, do we think, or is it likely to calm down, as it were, and just revert, as it were, to type in a couple of weeks from now? Anyone at all wants to comment on either of them?
I think we might take actually other questions in the interest of time, and we'll sort of see what we get to. I think there were some other hands, yeah?
So within the last 20 years, there was multiple disrespects to territorial integrity, but most notably by two veto member states who, the UK and the US namely, that they disrespected the territorial integrity of other states, and they have seen firsthand that they have no serious consequences. And by consequences, I'm not referring to sanctions. As a Syrian, those sanctions are not meaningful. They affect the population, not the government. So do you think this has given sort of a green light to Putin to go ahead and know that there would be no serious consequences for him for his aggression?
Any other things? Yes, I see a hand there. We'll take one at the back, and then we'll see how far we can get in the time we have. So please, yeah.
Thank you very much for great presentations, even if they are not most uplifting on a sunny day. But I just have two simple questions. One, if you don't mind, what would it take to, slowly, I imagine, shift focus in international law, from state and sovereignty to human beings and human rights? What does that mean? How does that happen? And for Brendan, very simple question. I dare you. He's my colleague, that's why I dare you. Right? Well, tell us, why now? Why is Putin doing what he is doing right now? Okay? Thank you.
And Judith, and one more there. We'll take those, and we'll see how far we can get, as I say, Judith. Yeah.
It's actually not for the panel, but thank you very much. But on an aside note, Brendan, so relieved to hear that they're expected to run out of ammunition next week. But in answer to the gentleman at the front there, when he was asking about the Russians, and the Russian foreign minister to England yesterday in an interview was already raising England's and America's violation of other state territories when she was being interviewed yesterday in a very angry answer when she was examined by a reporter yesterday, and she was saying nobody says anything when England and America violated state territory previously. So the other thing was, I was very alarmed this morning to see that they seized the nuclear power station that effectively, I believe, holds Europe to hostage.
Very significant development. I think there was one. Oh yeah, there you are.
I was wondering how likely you thought that maybe the rebellion could come from inside of Russia rather than internationally, because Alexei Navalny, even though he's still in jail, is still quite vocal about opposing Putin's establishment, and you see more and more people demonstrating in the streets of Russia, risking their lives for it. So do you think maybe that would be enough for this to come from inside of Russia rather than internationally?
Yeah, we don't really have a great deal of time, but Bernard, quite a few were being directed to you, so your oracle must speak.
There are 5 questions here. On Taiwan, the simple fact that one large country has invaded another large country without any legal, niceties and without any credible justification, other than this is the reintegration of territory that we regard as ours. If I was Taiwanese, I would be extremely afraid, because that sets a precedent. Now, if the Russian military operation ends up with a massive defeat or in quagmire, it may cause a pause on the more hawkish elements in Chinese politics. I think it's, just to be fair, and I'm always the person trying to search for balance a little bit, at least I try to, there are, and we don't hear this enough in the West, people I think within the Chinese system, both military, political and diplomatic, who are trying to win the conversation away from being hawkish on Taiwan. And they're trying to talk it down, and they're trying to talk away and down an imminent conflict with the United States of America, because it's just a disaster. It's a lose-lose for China and it's a lose-lose for America. I would hope that those people are empowered, but to be honest with you, I wouldn't be confident. I would actually, and I'm sorry to say this, I would be more pessimistic that by the end of the summer, the Russians will militarily have imposed a brutal solution of sorts in the Ukraine. The Western countries will not intervene that much. They will just intervene enough to salve their conscience, which will not produce any definitive military outcome or political outcome. And the lesson that the Chinese will draw is that you can do bold, dangerous, insane, violent things and get away with it. Which actually brings me to my, I think, Syrian friend, and I did mention that at the end there. And I agree with you, yeah, I wouldn't maybe go as far as you do. I think there are some differences between the illegal invasion, I think it's an illegal invasion of Iraq, and certainly a massively unwise invasion of Iraq by the Americans and one or two allies. But there's also some differences from the Ukrainian situation. I think the Ukrainian violation is that bit worse, although you might say that's silly to get into which is worse and which is less worse. But I think the Ukrainian violation of the idea of an international law-based system is more profound. There's and I won't get into that, but I think it does actually, that is where we're headed. That there are big states that feel when they need to, for whatever twisted logic they have, act outside international norms, they will go and do it. And I mean explicitly war making, I don't mean other forms of illegality. But they will wage large wars if they feel the need to do it, and that's a really bad precedent. Yeah, there is a connection between the Russians drawing some kind of inferences from that experience. Although I have to say that what's puzzling is that, as we all know, it didn't work out very well for America, the global war, the long war on terror. I mean, the Americans, Biden retreated from Afghanistan, and this segues into maybe Vesna's question, why is it happening now? I think Putin thinks that the West is particularly weak, and that's based on subjective, but it's also based on some objective criteria, which is that the West actually is very, very weak. Putin's not wrong in his estimation. And the bit that we don't want to talk about, but people like me do actually accept and talk about, is that in military terms, we have no cards on the table. And the only way that you're going to get into a negotiation with Putin that yields some kind of meaningful compromise is by demonstrating your military capability to match. And that includes a nuclear capability to match. So that's why I said we're back into the twisted, demented logic of 1979, 80, 81, 82, 83. So that's not good, because that's a bad situation. I'm going to shut up there and let my colleagues speak.
I'll just have one very brief comment on sort of what Shane was saying there about the security debate in Ireland, and I suppose I would say that one of the justifications that was given for Ireland being neutral in World War II was that we were, we're a new state, and we needed to sort of defend our own sovereignty against a former, occupier and so forth. It's been 100 years. I think we're pretty secure in that sense, and it might be time to have a serious discussion.
Very interesting. And Ekaterina, there's a question for you from
Yeah, so I will just start maybe slightly far away from that question, because I wanted to also to connect to the question about the previous reaction of international law to other events. Because it's true that not everything is comparable, but at the same time, if you think about the suffering on the ground, then you will see that how comparable it is and how little compassion actually came from the international community for all these territories. And the obvious answer is, to that is why this happened is very simple, is that because, okay, this is so close to us, these are people whom we accept as part of us, and those are some strange, they have strange culture, yeah. So, and maybe if we do now try to think how wrong actions of international community, or let's say inadequate, were in all those situations previously, and we try to draw lessons for now, because we see also what are the consequences of those actions. We see that it means that Russia can think that it can do things that are not allowed. And Russia seeks justification from these things that, as I said, maybe the voice, you see, this voice in general public was not so strong. By international law, it's all said it's illegal, whether we talk about Serbia, whether we talk about Iraq or Afghanistan. From international law point of view, 99% of lawyers say it's illegal. But the voice in the general public, the general opposition to that, and general compassion with the people was not at the level. And so we see that this now allows Russia to think that they can go unpunished. And therefore, if we draw lessons from that, and you know, the High Commissioner for Refugees, I mentioned this, I know that there are some students here, and I'm repeating myself for students, but I still want to say it for everybody. High Commissioner for Refugees, when he was speaking to Security Council on the situation in Ukraine, he also said to them, you know, we have so many Ukrainian refugees, we help them and so on, but don't forget, we also have Afghan refugees, we also have Syrian refugees, we also have all other to take care of. So why there was no such compassion for other refugees in those situations, and why we have it today? So this is the first point which can lead us to something where we will pay more attention to human rights than we pay to sovereignty of states. And the second point is, we see now how wrong the situation with Security Council is, and there are some discussion excluding Russia from General Assembly or from Security Council or whatever. But the key point is whether these 5 players who have permanent veto will be able to abandon it. Because that's really, we need a reform of the Security Council, we need a reform of these institutions. And this also means that US, UK, France and China have to agree to that. And if they agree, this will be a really game-changing moment for international law, drawing lessons from this situation. But if no, then yeah, it's more difficult.
Probably a good point at which to end in the interest of time. I want to make a series of thanks, but first to mention that there'll be an online talk and session that Matej is going to be convening on Tuesday at 5 o'clock. That's online, hosted by the Moore Institute, with a very impressive lineup of speakers, and includes Róisín as well. Very much looking forward to that, so an opportunity to continue our discussion. I want to thank David Kelly, who's been recording, and to Matthew Garrity, who's looking after us as well in terms of publicity for this event. But above all, to Brendan, Róisín, and Ekaterina for wonderful talks and for helping us to think through this important situation. So thank you very much.